Great American Literature webinar series hosted by the National Association of Scholars. My name is David Randall, Director of Research, and today, I am delighted to discuss Marilynne Robinson's novel, Gilead, a wonderful novel, which I've read myself. And I'm saying this boastingly and proudly. And however, we get to have three specialists, and I am not going to list all their publications, which are long and distinguished. These will be appearing on the chat button beneath. But briefly, whom we have today is Dr. Alex Engebretson, who is a senior lecturer at Baylor University, who has contributed essays to the edited collections Protestant Aesthetics and the Arts and Marilynne Robinson. Dr. Alex Sosler, who is assistant professor of Bible and Ministry at Montreat College, author of the forthcoming book, Love as the Way to Learning, also an edited collection of essays, Theology, and the Avett Brothers. Excuse me. And then Dr. Abram van Engen, who is Dean's Fellow for Educational Innovations and Initiatives, Professor of English and Professor of Religion and Politics, by courtesy, at Washington University in St. Louis, and author of Sympathetic Puritans and City on a Hill, A History of American Exceptionalism. So I will just say briefly how we're setting this up. Each of our speakers will speak happily, conversationally, informally for maybe 12 to 14 minutes each. There will then be a Q&A session moderated by me. Ideally, this will be questions from you, the audience, either in the chat or the Q&A buttons. The Q&A, I believe, now has an upvote feature, which can help. I will maybe ask a question or two of my own, but ideally be passing on questions by you, the audience, not in chronological order, just in whatever order seems like would make for a fun conversation. But do not worry, if you have any questions left over at the end, send them to me, randall@nas.org. I will pass them on to the speakers so they can have the option of replying to you. So never worry about a question getting lost. And then also, don't worry about not having a chance to see this if you have to like suddenly break for a bagel or something. This will be recorded and will be on the National Association of Scholars YouTube channel within 24 hours. So available for posterity, everyone can see it. Having said all that, Dr. Engebretson.
Thanks so much. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you so much for this opportunity. And I'm excited to talk about this terrific book, which I've spent a lot of time reading and teaching, much to my surprise. It kind of found me. So when I was asked what makes this book a great American novel, really three things came to mind. The first was the style in which it's written, the kind of music of the prose, John Ames's voice. The second thing was its historical scope. It really is an ambitious novel, even though it's a short novel, but it has this grand kind of historical scope to it. And the third thing I want to talk about is its religious vision. So the way in which it really extols this like high value in perception and viewing nature. It gives it a kind of religious charge. So those will really be my three points. I remember reading Gilead for the first time, and the thing that really stuck with me after the first reading was John Ames's voice. It was the music, it was the prose, it was the style. It didn't sound like any other voice I'd heard in contemporary literature. It was serious and calm. It was unironic. One critic called it fiercely calm. I've always liked that description of it. And yet it was capable of humor too. It had this kind of gentle Midwestern humor that was really appealing. And I just want to read the first sentence, just in case you haven't read it or just to give you a sample of the style. I told you last night that I might be gone sometime, and you said, where? And I said, to be with the good Lord. And you said, why? And I said, because I'm old. And you said, I don't think you're old. And the style is so plain and just kind of colloquial and almost monosyllabic at times. It's really doing kind of what Hemingway, I think, aspired to do, is finding expressive possibilities in kind of ordinary common words. And the origins of the voice of John Ames is pretty interesting. Robinson said that the voice found her, and she talks about this a lot in terms of how she conceives of novels. A voice will occur to her, and the voice that occurred to her was John Ames's voice, which she called theological and Iowan. She was also reading a lot of American pragmatist philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce at the time. Peirce is a voice that she found really appealing. She said that his voice could take on any questions of any scale without the least bit of self-consciousness to it. So this voice has this regional specificity to Iowa. It has this comfort with theological abstractions, and it's kind of free of the irony and self-consciousness that we find so often in contemporary fiction. I think the voice is just kind of an achievement on its own, really. And I found with rereaders of Gilead, the thing that they really want to return to is the presence of John Ames, his voice, and the kind of emotional immediacy of that first person narration. So I just want to spend just a minute like unpacking this choice that Robinson makes to tell this story in the first person. And I see it kind of connecting with some literary traditions that are much older than this book. The first is this tradition of confession. And I think confession is actually a good way to describe Gilead in terms of what genre to kind of put it in within the novel. Confession kind of back through Rousseau, back to Augustine, Northrop Frye called confession introverted, yet intellectualized in content. And I think that's a kind of nice way to think about the book. Other scholars have put the book in terms of, in conversation with this philosophical novel tradition that really gets going maybe with Saul Bellow in the 1950s, kind of reviving this novel of ideas that kind of goes back to maybe Thomas Mann, Dostoevsky. I think you can make a claim that John Ames's voice, with its ability to do this theological work, kind of, you can frame it in terms of a philosophical novel. And the other, I think, productive way to think about it is to track it back to the Puritans. And in some ways, Robinson is reviving this tradition, this Puritan tradition, where parents who are facing kind of their imminent decline write to their children to pass on spiritual wisdom. And we have a lot of examples of this. Anne Bradstreet wrote a short prose called "To My Dear Children," and it has a very similar setup to Gilead. So that's kind of the voice, the style, and it's kind of links to tradition. But I think if all Gilead was like a confession, if it was really about a dying man writing to pass on his wisdom to a son, or if really all it was this conflict with Jack Boughton, who John Ames has to kind of get over his anger and jealousy toward Jack and kind of turn to him and make him a spiritual son. Like, I don't think we would be talking about Gilead today. I think it's more ambitious than that. It has this historical dimension. It talks about these great historical, crisis points in American history, like the Civil War, the abolitionism. It talks about slavery and racial segregation. It talks about the history of religion and politics, it has a lot of history there. And I see Robinson kind of interacting with some of her contemporary peers like Toni Morrison, Thomas Pynchon, E.L. Doctorow, people who are engaged in revising historical narratives. So I just want to touch on one historical narrative, and that is the history of the Midwest, which Robinson, after she moved to Iowa, got really, really interested in. The history of the Midwest is not very interesting to most people. I asked my students to list their associations with Iowa, and I teach in Texas, and most have never visited Iowa. And the best they come up with usually is corn. That's not enough. Robinson calls Iowa and the Midwest in general, a highly distinctive and crucial region that's generally assumed to have neither culture nor history. And I see Gilead as wanting to correct that, to give Iowa a sense of culture and history. She tries to she's inventing in a way the identity of Iowa. She sees it as influenced by all these New Englanders, these kind of radically progressive New Englanders who moved into the Midwest, founded kind of important institutions like Lane Theological Seminary and Oberlin College, these progressive institutions that admitted women and African Americans really early on. She wants to celebrate this history and to call our attention to it. She wants it to not seem so strange that Ulysses S. Grant would call it, the shining star of radicalism, which is this phrase that appears in the book several times. Often ironically, because the community of Gilead doesn't live up to the radicalism that's like embodied in the grandfather figure, the radical implications of abolitionism and racial unity don't happen in Gilead. So Robinson has this historical imagination, and it's really important to the book. In that way, I see her as having an affinity with someone like Faulkner, who had to have his little, postage stamp of native soil, Yoknapatawpha. He needed this place with a rich history to explore, and that's important to the book as well. The last thing I want to talk about is the religious vision of the book. There are all these moments, right, in the novel where we see a soap bubble floating past John Ames's window, or he happens to see the rainbow of colors in the child's hair. And there are Robinson gives these little quiet moments of beauty, of perception, a kind of religious significance. We're in the presence, we're invited into this sense of wonder and awe in the quotidian. And, Robinson says, ordinary things have always seemed numinous to me. And the book really pushes this idea and invites us into this vision that sees in ordinary things the numinous. John Ames says something like, wherever you turn your eyes, the world can shine like transfiguration. You don't have to bring a thing to it except a little willingness to see. So this high value that the book places on vision, on perception, Robinson's going to trace that back to her very idiosyncratic reading of John Calvin's theology with its view of perception of the world. And if you just take a couple quotes from Calvin, it starts to sound a lot like John Ames. I have just a brief quote here from Calvin. This is Calvin, wherever from its Institutes, Wherever you turn your eyes, there's no portion of the world, however minute, that does not exhibit at least some sparks of beauty. While it's impossible to contemplate the vast and beautiful fabric as it extends around without being overwhelmed by the immense weight of glory. So Robinson's going to seize on these aspects of Calvin where, these metaphors of vision and mirrors and seeing, and all of this is going to make its way into a kind of spiritual vision of the book. In this way, Robinson kind of self-consciously, I think, joins some authors, some earlier American authors like Whitman and Dickinson and Melville to a certain extent, who are also kind of influenced by this Puritan Calvinistic view of nature. And I think you can kind of talk about John Updike and even a filmmaker like Terrence Malick or somebody like this kind of sharing in this ecstatic view of the ordinary. How much time do I have? I think that's almost it. I'll just, is it okay if I just close with one little thing?
One last, sure, fine.
One little thing. And I'd love to hear what you guys think about Robinson's kind of reputation as it stands right now. But my sense is it's really split between inside the academy and her popular reputation. Inside the academy, when I talk to people about Robinson, it's all about housekeeping. And the first novel, Housekeeping, is what poets and writers want to talk to me about. When I talk about Gilead and the Gilead novels, it's often outside the institution of the university. And Oprah's book club, for example, just picked up all the Gilead novels and republished them. So she has, I think, the makings of having a kind of popular literary reputation. So that's going to be interesting to see how that all plays out. And she had encountered a lot of younger authors when she was teaching at Iowa writing workshops. So I think she's going to have a big impact on younger authors as well going forward. So that's my talk. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Dr. Sosler.
Yeah, thank you. Honored to be here, honored to be a part of this panel. I think it's set up a good curation from the National Association of Scholars. You guys did a great job. And so there's two things that when I think about Gilead and the great American novel, I'm thinking about that question, not necessarily because it was written in America, but what makes it enduring or endearing to Americans. So I tend to see Augustine in everything. And he defines a people by their common love, their common objects of love, right? So if America is defined by these common objects of love, what loves maybe do Gilead illustrate that make it endearing to Americans? And so two things that I kind of see in the novel. The first one, and I think it piggybacks right off of Dr. Engebretson, Dr. Alex, and that's an earthy spirituality, right? So he defined it a few other ways, seeing the sacredness in ordinary things. But when I mean earthy spirituality, it's not starting kind of from these lofty theological subjects or constructs, but from a lived reality, right? So Gilead writes from or has a theology maybe from the ground up rather than the top down, right? It starts from the body. It starts from the sounds and sights and smells and touches of the world, right? So Reverend Ames talks about baptizing a cat or receiving a biscuit from his father after the African-American church burns down, and this ashy biscuit was like communion to him, right? So it starts with these lived experiences, and it creates a theology maybe from that, right? So I've called it sacramental in an article I wrote for Front Porch Republic, right? These ordinary objects that are more than just an object, the divine reality beyond and behind the mere material thing that's there. And so it's in the earthiness, it's in the touches and the tastes and the sounds of other people, and I think it considers, well, there has to be more to this thing than the molecules that hold it together. There's got to be something sacred about these experiences that we're having, and it works kind of the theology from there. And if you read Marilynne Robinson's essays, these ideas are all prevalent, right? It was what she's trying to do. That, and I think so. I over the break, I read a novel or a memoir by Julian Barnes, who's a English literature writer, and this memoir is on mortality. And he starts off this memoir by saying, "I don't believe in God, but I miss him." And I think perhaps in American society, we could say, well, I don't believe in generosity, but I miss it. Or maybe we don't have the resources for deep graciousness and love, but we wish we did. And I think in modernity, kind of this rationalistic, objective world where everything becomes explainable, right? We know how love works because we know the neurons in the brain that fires. And this kind of inculcates maybe a culture where critique and cancellation and suspicion runs rampant, where people confuse what people accuse the Puritans of, this kind of stemming from fear of the other, fear of difference. And I think Americans read Gilead and they think, man, this is actually more true to my lived experience, what I want my lived experience to be, what I miss my lived experience to be, this deep resources of generosity and graciousness that we're kind of missing. And so Robinson, I think, provides this gracious, generous seeing of the world and being in the world that even if it's not how we live or how maybe we would define American society, it's how we want it to be, right? There's the beyond that we experience in life that goes beyond the explainable. In an essay that Marilynne Robinson writes, she has this line that how we think about ourselves has everything to do with how we treat one another. And I think Robinson, again, just provides this, this way of seeing humanity, way of seeing creation, that human beings are image bearers with souls, right? There's this deep, unexplainable, there's the soul, this place that you can't point to where the soul is in your body. It's not made up of any molecules. It's not scientifically, you can't prove it, but we all realize that there's this thing about us that gives us dignity and worth that's beyond what we make or what we accomplish, or our intelligence that gives us these deep resources to treat one another well. So rather than view people as their worst comment or decision, right, as Jack, maybe we would be prone to view Jack as like, well, we can just write him off, we can cancel him, we don't need to treat him well because he treats other people poorly. We presume the goodness of fellow human beings. And this idea is inspired by love rather than fear, right, where everything's objective, rational, kind of our modern maybe milieu. Robinson writes in with deep love to her characters, right? And I think the influences of that are no surprise. What she writes about a ton are the reformers and the Puritans, which again, the cultural imagination is that they're harsh, rigid, fearful. But for her, the idea of total depravity, that that our depravity, our lostness, our evilness isn't as worst it can be, but it influences every ounce or every capacity that we have. That it doesn't mean that there's a negativity towards the creative world, right? Because there's one way to kind of be reformed and to think the whole world's bad because we're all depraved. For Robinson, total depravity results in a grace and a generosity and a commonality that because we're all depraved, because we're all fallen and sinful, that ought to inspire a deep graciousness and kindness to one another because we know how fallen we are. And if you read, right, the passage that Dr. Alex quoted from the Institutes, right? Wherever you turn your eyes, there's a portion of the world, however minute, that does not exhibit at least some sparks of beauty. That we can see beauty in the created world if we have the courage and the eyes to see it. And in another essay, Robinson writes, love means awe and awe means love. That depravity is a doctrine that doesn't write people off, but gives people deep resources of humility and graciousness with one another. So in terms of a great American novel, I think it draws on our collective gaze, it draws our collective gaze higher, that we treat one another with generosity as our founding documents inspire, that we see the beauty in the created world. And so for a well-functioning democracy, we must be prone to a certain level of graciousness. And so I think that's one way, this earthy spirituality, right, point one, that makes the Gilead, that inspires our gaze higher to be the American people and to have the American dream, to maybe re-inspire the American dream in ways that we're not living it. The second thing, maybe point two, is that it reckons with race. So, and I think these two things are related because there's an earthy spirituality, because that inspires a graciousness and generosity to one another. That means we must reckon with race. And so Dietrich Bonhoeffer, another one of Robinson's great theological influences, writes about the grace of God being in all of life, an earthly spirituality, actually indicts us. That because Christ is present in the persecuted, he must be honored. So an earthly spirituality means that we have a responsibility toward our neighbor. In other words, this second feature of Gilead deals with the felt experience of America being different from our ideas about America. And you can see this in Reverend Ames dealing with race in his own life. He, in the Bloody Kansas kind of narratives where he talks about his grandfather going out and fighting battles and his father having kind of these debates about which way is the right way to do it. Should he be a pacifist? Should he go fight? In one of the scenes is Reverend Ames' father bearing a gun and then digging it up and then reburying it and then ending up throwing it in the river. And so there's this dismembering of the memory, kind of the hiding the guilt of the grandfather's abolition cause. Or in the case of that African-American church burning, he calls it a little fire that actually burned the whole African-American church down, that displaced then African-Americans from the town of Gilead. So in a sense, there's this repressing, disremembering the past, which again, I think is another American love that maybe makes it a great American novel, that we dismember the past a lot. And so while it's important to highlight those who see, right, this ocular vision that Dr. Alex referred to as well, right? This idea of having the courage to see the beauty of the world. It's also important to note what the people in Gilead are blind to. In Gilead, Reverend Ames had the eyes to see Jack's situation and to be sympathetic to him. Once he saw that they're not that much different, Reverend Ames and Jack, that they're both dads reckoning with time and togetherness with their family, then he offers him grace and generosity. However, he didn't have the courage to see how the historically abolitionist town could welcome interracial marriage. He didn't have the courage to see that. His eyes weren't open to that. And so you can see this in how the novel ends. So after referencing Augustine on how God loves each of us as his only child, Reverend Ames writes, theologians talk about prevenient grace that precedes grace itself and allows us to accept it. I think there also must be a thing also be a prevenient courage that allows us to be brave. That is, to acknowledge that there is more beauty than our eyes can bear, that precious things have been put into our hands, and to do nothing to honor them is to do great harm. And therefore, this courage allows us, as the old men said, to make ourselves useful. It allows us to be generous, which is another way of saying the same thing. To be useful and generous, to give honor, to recognize grace. And his last words written to his young son and subsequently to us are this: I'll pray that you grow up a brave man in a brave country. I will pray you find a way to be useful. I'll pray, then I'll sleep. And so we need this courageous bravery to reckon with our racial past, that the beauty of humanity has not been recognized and affirmed, and that we failed to live up to our ideas, and the courage to be useful with our eyes open. President Obama, in an interview with Marilynne Robinson, said, "What makes America wonderful, we always have this nagging dissatisfaction that spurs us on." And so I think in the same vein that we have this earthy spirituality that sees the beauty in created ordinary things, I think what also makes Gilead a great American novel is that it also has this nagging dissatisfaction that spurs us on, this needed bravery and courage that we don't yet have. It's because graciousness doesn't mean that God loves everybody and so everybody's all right? That would be cheap grace, to use Bonhoeffer language. But that grace implicates us. We need to have the moral courage to live into grace and to drink more grace, knowing our blindness. That's the costly grace that Bonhoeffer talks about. Understanding grace is about an encounter. What does God want from this encounter? And in Calvin's tradition, the person in the encounter is God. So each person you encounter is God. So what does God demand of you in each encounter? And these are the questions that I think Americans need to wrestle with, ought to wrestle with, and what makes Gilead a great American novel.
Thank you so much. Dr. Van Engen.
Thank you. Well, it's lovely to be here. Thanks for having me. And I think I'm just going to expand on points already made and draw them out a little further. In many ways, I think this novel is a great novel, partly because I think what it asks us to do from so many different angles is pay attention. And largely what the novel is about is the act of paying attention. And in different ways, paying attention to different things. So you could pay attention to the world in which we live, the nature around us, the people around us. But you can also pay attention to history in certain kinds of ways and the way that it informs the world in which we live. And in some ways, what this novel is about is a minister who is incredibly gracious, incredibly warm and friendly, who is a model, really, of the ways to pay attention to human beings around him, a model of the way to pay attention to the world in which we live, who at the same time has failed to pay attention to the history of the town in which he's lived. And what I love about Robinson, and I think is a pretty rare and unique gift, is that she can love people so well and at the same time be critical of them. And this town is a kind of example of that throughout the book, where she clearly loves this town through the character of John Ames. She clearly loved John Ames. And at the same time, it's a novel about ultimately the failure of this town to basically a town founded for the sake of abolitionism has chased out all of its Black residents. And that's really the background history of this novel, a novel that begins with abolitionism and the Civil War, ends in 1956. So that's basically when this novel is taking place, right at the cusp of the Civil Rights Movement. And it's an all-white town that has no place for an interracial marriage. And so we begin with abolitionism and we end with the failures of that. And we trace the long history of that through 3 generations of ministers, all named John Ames, the first of whom was violent and bloody and visionary, an abolitionist who was willing to kill for the sake of abolitionism. The second John Ames is a pacifist who rejects his father's ways, and they have a fraught relationship because of it. And the third, the John Ames, who's the narrator of this book, is trying to find his own way between those two, and has a kind of vision that is different from either one of them. And part of that vision is summed up in the words that he later says to his son, that right worship is right perception. And I think that line lies at kind of the heart of a lot of what we see in this novel. So to just give an example of that, he was recounting it early in the novel. He's recounting a time when he and his father traipsed all the way across Kansas to find his grandfather's body, his grave. And it was a hard trip, and they didn't have any food, and it was a terrible journey, but they did it anyway. And they're standing there at the grave, and at the moment that they're standing there, feeling as though there's nothing else they can do, the moon is rising in the east as the sun is setting in the west, and the two lights are reflected across each other. And it's this incredible moment of light, where it feels like light on one side of the horizon and light on the other side of the horizon are making this moment sacred, and they're standing right in the middle of them. And he comments on that to his father, who's praying at the time. His father notes it. Later in the story, we return to that moment. And his father says to him, his father, who ends up sort of becoming, at the very end of his life, something of an atheist to reconnect with a different child of his. He says to the Reverend John Ames, the narrator, everybody in Kansas saw the same thing we saw. And what he's trying to do is downplay how incredible it was, that moment. And what the Reverend John Ames says, thinking back to himself as a child at that moment, he says, at the time, he says, remember, I was 12. I took him to mean the entire state was a witness to our miracle. I thought the whole state could vouch for the particular blessing my father had brought down by praying there at his father's grave, or the glory that my grandfather had somehow emanated out of his parched repose. Later, I realized my father would have meant that the sun and moon aligned themselves as they did with no special reference to the two of us. And what you could see there happening is this line very carefully treaded between the religious and the secular, and really in some ways between Romanticism, which was a huge influence on Marilynne Robinson, as Alex Engebretson has written about. The whole period of the American Renaissance was a huge influence on Marilynne Robinson. And that stands on one end of that gulf. And on the other end of that gulf stands modernism, and a world of no purpose, of no meaning, of no particular reference to any particular person, right? So Stephen Crane's famous poem, "A man said to the universe, 'Sir, I exist,' and the universe replied, 'The fact is created in me no special obligation,' right? So this sense of a universe that's uncaring, it has no meaning to it, is on one end of the gulf, and a universe with purpose and meaning and relevance is on the other end. And this narrator is walking right between those two. And the difference comes down to a matter of perception. Do you perceive a moment like that as miraculous, or do you perceive a moment like that as mundane? And that's the question that this novel is raising. Is the mundane miraculous, and what would make it so? And at every moment, we're looking at a scene that is incredibly mundane. And at every moment, that scene could be just filled and replete with meaning and miracle, depending on how you want to perceive it. And so in many ways, the novel is a kind of perfect case study of what Charles Taylor talks about in A Secular Age as the new secular age, in which religion is an option among many, but not necessarily an option that you have to choose or that has been chosen. And one of the key differences is between a self that is open to transcendence and a self that is buffered against it. Is transcendence possible in the world? What makes it possible, and when is it possible, and when is it perceived? And this is really key to her whole theology and her whole way of writing, because as she writes elsewhere in the novel, sacredness and blessing and baptism and sacrament, what they are doing at the heart of it is not creating something as sacred, but recognizing something as sacred. So she talks about baptism as not a moment that creates the sacred in another, but rather a particular moment that recognizes the sacred in another. And so this is what John Ames says about baptism. He says, there's a reality in blessing, which I take baptism to be primarily. It doesn't enhance sacredness, but it acknowledges it, and there's a power in that. Later, he goes on to say, this is right after he talks about right worship is right perception. He's talking about the 10 Commandments and all the sort of misguided understandings of what the 10 Commandments are. And he says this about the 10 Commandments to his son: there's a pattern in these commandments of setting things apart so that their holiness will be perceived. Every day is holy, but the Sabbath is set apart so that the holiness of time can be experienced. And he says later, the root of real honor is always the sense of the sacredness of the person who is its object. When you love someone to the degree you love her, you see her as God sees her. And that is an instruction in the nature of God and humankind and of being itself. And really that line of thinking proceeds through all of these Gilead novels, including the latest one that came out a year ago called Jack, where there's not really an explanation for why Della, who's African-American, falls in love with Jack, who's this white man with not a lot going for him, except she says at one point, I saw him as God sees him. I saw his soul, and that was all. And so this line of perception proceeds through all these novels. And why it matters is because the way that Robinson is really addressing race in these novels is about the sacredness of the individual. And so one of the things I'm writing about right now, and it'll come out later, is her vision is of, in many ways, individuals are radically alike and radically dissimilar. And what that enables is a sense of what draws us all together being all having a soul, all being sacred, all being made in the image of God, which is really a key concept of her whole theology. And at the same time, that we are all basically worlds unto ourselves. That there is something about another person that is fundamentally mysterious to everybody else, that is hidden, undisclosed, unknown to everybody else, which makes them more than anyone could know about them. And what drops out from this is she is not big on, or does not really talk much about, the sort of communal identities that draw us. So she's very big on individuals as radically alike and radically dissimilar. I don't think she talks very much about communities, though she's pro-community for sure. She just doesn't talk about communal identities as such very often in her work, from what I perceive. Even the minister is often in solitude, often lonely, often in a church by himself, and communing with God in those spaces. But it heightens the sort of the sacredness of the individual, and that's really key to a lot of what she has to say. One other thing I would like to say about this novel, for just a minute, is that it's a great novel for thinking about what happens in all great novels, which is that, as I teach my students, nothing is gratuitous, which is to say nothing is not there that is not necessary. And this is a particularly good novel for teaching that lessons to students, because if you're looking for a plot, you won't find one in the first 100 pages of this novel. Some of my students very struggle when they read this novel because it's so slow and nothing seems to be happening and no tension seems to be arising. And there isn't a sense of conflict, apart from the fact that the minister is dying. That's bad, that's a tension. But other than that, all he's doing is walking around observing things for 100 pages. And they want to know, what is the deal with this novel? What is going to happen? There isn't anything happening. And after 100 pages, things start to happen again, where Jack, the bad son, the prodigal son, returns. And he has, we find out late in the novel, a Black wife. And that's what this conflict is about. And that's how this conflict is resolved. But the minister, who sees the sacredness in everything and everyone, cannot see the sacred in Jack because of Jack's past throughout almost the entirety of this novel. And that's really the struggle of the novel. And the way that he eventually sees and perceives Jack as sacred is, again, a mystery is revealed, that Jack is more than he seems, that he has done what in fact this town has not done, which is embraced interracial marriage. And the atheist Jack has done what the religious town could not do and would not do. And so the book is really interesting in that regard. But I'll just give one quick indication of this. Nothing is gratuitous, and why it's a fun novel for that. So one of the ways I do this is on page 57, if you have the novel, there's one little paragraph where the minister goes to the dying home of somebody named Lacey Thrush. And I once thought I'd write a whole article about this one paragraph. Because on the one hand, this paragraph is totally unnecessary. It does nothing to the plot. There isn't even a plot at this point. It tells us very little about the minister. It tells us very little about anything. It's like it's a paragraph that if it weren't there, wouldn't be missed. But the fact of its presence changes everything. And that, I think, is the way to approach any paragraph of any great novel. So the question really to ask is, why is it there? Why did it take up the space that it took up? And Lacey Thrush is named Lacey Thrush because she is the last of two lines of families, the Lacey's and the Thrushes, who have all left Gilead. And so her death is the end of two families. And you begin to see in this paragraph that there are histories upon histories upon histories through which this minister is moving. There are stories upon stories upon stories. And in this one paragraph, we get a glimpse of the way that every individual he sees in the novel could be a novel unto themselves. And that becomes the larger point about how every human being is sacred. If you think of every human being as a novel unto themselves, that is not told, that it comes and goes in passing, that you'd have to sit down with a long time to understand, you begin to see the sacredness of the individuals with which we're dealing. And so he says, I'm full of admiration for her. These old saints bless us every chance they get. But you get a sense of, we're getting one particular story here, but there are stories upon stories upon stories. And in the very first paragraph, he says to his son, there are many ways to live a good life. And a page later, he says, talking about all the confessions that come to him as a minister, there's a lot under the surface of life. Everyone knows that. So one of the things this novel is doing is it's giving us a particular story to indicate that there are stories upon stories upon stories, that all you have to do is pay attention. And the sacredness of individual life will begin to surface. There's plenty more to say, but I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you so much. So I encourage everybody to send in questions. There are a number here. There's a bunch from Dr. Shahid Safar. Forgive me, Doctor. I want to go to Kevin Pete's question and build on it a little. For Dr. Sosler, do you think it is more difficult for graciousness in urban, gritty America? And I want to build on that question a little bit. How much is this radical grace a product of being in a small town in Iowa? How much do you have to be in a small town in Iowa to have this radical grace? How much does it generalize? And when you're talking about audience, therefore, this is another way of putting it. Is this a great Iowa novel? Is it a great American novel? Is it a great Christian novel? Or is it a great human novel? And that all relates to how rooted is this religious experience in the particular time and place?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think it's impossible in a urban setting. I think it has to do with what you say, like rootedness. Is it easier to know your neighbors in a small Iowa town? I suppose maybe. It depends on how transient the part of the city you live is, how committed you are to being there for a long time. And I think, again, like it's more an indictment on contemporary American culture than I think it is cities. And so I don't think graciousness is harder. I think graciousness is harder maybe in American cities because people don't take time to know their neighbors, or at least it's just easier to live transactionally. Where, like, again, if you read like a Wendell Berry novel, like that idea of the communal web of which you're living and the necessity of each person in that place, and we're not going anywhere, so we got to live together regardless if I like you or not. We got to just kind of come and make this work. I think contemporary American transient culture makes it harder. Kind of the homelessness that Wendell Berry talks about makes it harder. Yeah, but not cities in general.
And that question isn't meant to be just limited to you. If either two doctors would like to speak to this.
I mean, I'm tempted to talk about some of the other Gilead novels, which do have urban scenes in them. Lila, has a whole kind of history. Jack's in kind of Jim Crow's St. Louis. I think Robinson's imagination extends out to those urban spaces. And she does talk about Grace and as inhabiting those spaces. But I do think there's a level of comfort that she has in these rural pockets. I mean, she grew up in Western Idaho. She seems connected to, small places. Lila eventually, she has a run through the city, but she eventually ends up in Gilead. So yeah, it's interesting to think about the role of the city versus these kinds of rural spaces in her books.
Yeah, I think she does rural spaces particularly well. So in that sense, it's a kind of regional novel. As you say, Jack takes place in St. Louis, although a quarter of the book of Jack takes place in one scene in a sort of pastoral cemetery setting. So I don't think she does cities particularly well. I don't think it's necessarily her strong point, but I don't see why that would matter, in the sense that we need great American novels that are set in the city. We need great American novels that are set in the country and in rural settings. We need both. And I don't expect any novelist who's a great novelist of the city to be able to write about Iowa in any particularly well crafted way. And I don't think that's disqualifying. So I do think it's particularly good about the countryside. It's particularly good about the Midwest, and Housekeeping is particularly good about the West and the kind of Idaho setting that she grew up in. I would say I just love this. This just came to mind as you were talking, but right near the end of the novel, they have a vision of the good life, basically a vision drawn from Zechariah of what the end times happily should look like. And they said, these are two old ministers talking to each other. There shall yet old men and old women dwell in the streets of Jerusalem, and every man with his staff in his hand for every age. And the streets of the city shall be full of boys and girls playing in the streets thereof. That is the prophecy, a vision of the prophet Zechariah. He says it will be marvelous in the eyes of the people, and so it might well be to people almost anywhere in this sad world, to play catch of an evening, to smell the river, to hear the train pass. These little towns were once the bold ramparts meant to shelter just such peace. And I think that that's one of those wonderful passages that cuts both ways. On the one hand, it praises Gilead for having created that shelter and that peace and a sense of that, that glorious just ease of living. And at the same time, it's an indictment of Gilead for having not given that shelter and that peace to the Black families that were there, and in fact chased them out of town. That all of that peace that was meant for them was not, in fact, that they were not included in it, and were chased out of town. So it's one of those great passages that does both at once, a prophecy that both praises and condemns at the same time.
Thank you. I want to go to, well, there's a whole bunch of questions from Dr. Zafar. I want to, you have two of them, which are in effect talking about communities. The importance of grace towards the community, happiness of community. And you were, I think, saying, the three of you, that community is terribly important in Gilead, but on the other hand, the point of view is somehow radically individualistic, shorn of community. I guess, so is this a tension? Is this a failure in Marilynne Robinson, or is this actually what's particularly Calvinist about it, that there's a radical individualism which is supposed to build towards the importance of community?
Well, I wrote a book about community and Calvinism called Sympathetic Puritans, about just how important sympathy was to Puritanism overall. And I think that that Robinson has that sense. I mean, she does have that sense. She understands that side of Puritanism. She understands the communal aspects of it. But I do find in her a focus on individualism that I would say is more informed by the American Renaissance than it is by the long history of Puritanism. The American Renaissance was so focused on the individual mind, if you think about Emerson and Thoreau and others. And that really was a shaping influence on her. When she was in college, when she was in graduate school, the American Renaissance was huge. It was taught all over the place. And these were the great works of American literature. And she took that to heart, and she wrote she writes in that vein, having been deeply influenced by them. Again, I would say Alex Engebretson's book on understanding Marilynne Robinson has a really wonderful chapter section on the influence of the American Renaissance on her. And I would say the focus on the individual really comes from that more than from the long history of Calvinism.
Other folks, Dr. Engebretson, yourself? Dr.
Sure.
Sosler?
I mean, that's basically what I was going to say, that I see it as an Emersonian inheritance, that she's focused on individuality. But I think there's a way to, I mean, Gilead's an epistolary novel, right? It's a letter, and there's a sense in which community is sort of embedded there. It's a very intimate community, the family, but I think Robinson in general is more comfortable writing about domesticity and family community rather than, larger institutions, and those kinds of things aren't really her concern in the novels. But, I mean, the family is I would say, and the idea of home is central to her imagination. And so I agree. It's individualistic, and she said, she loves the individualism of the West, and the kind of the great romances of the West are important to her. And clearly Emerson and Dickinson and these kinds of figures are also informing her. But there's a sense of community on a small scale that she really values.
And Dr. Sosler, do you want to add, or?
No, I think those are right. I mean, I think, she I think admittedly is a bookish person, and I think like even the nature of this novel, right? This dying man who's writing a letter to his son at the same time that like him, you would think if he's dying, well, why not just spend time with your son? Why are you just writing this letter to your son? And it's like this individual focus, this bookish focus. And I think Robinson adds something to the biblical imagination that is necessary for contemporary Christianity today. But I don't think she's been formed with a full Christian consciousness to appreciate the communal formation, that like what gives the communal courage eyes to see. How does one communally formed? It does tend to be kind of individual formation, which I think is necessary, but not full.
I mean, I would say that she, all of her main characters are pretty solitary and pretty lonesome people. We're a far cry from Edith Wharton and her society doings and goings ons and so on. But again, that to me means we just need to read more novels. Like certain people are really great at certain kinds of novels, and she is. I don't think there's any other person who writes the solitary, lonesome character as well as Marilynne Robinson. But that's a certain kind of character, right? That's not the only kind of character.
So to get a beat on the Calvinism, so how would Gilead be different if the protagonist were a Lutheran minister in Iowa? Or let us say, is there a great Iowa Lutheran novel to which this should be compared to, which does have a distinctive point of view?
It would probably be more music if it was Lutheran. No, I mean, I do think it's pretty Congregationalist and pretty Calvinist. It's hard to know exactly what would change with the Lutheran a Lutheran minister. His best friend is Presbyterian, which isn't a far cry from Congregationalism. I mean, far enough that they fought in the 1600s, but not far enough in 20th century America that they're that different. No, I mean, I do think it would make a difference, or like a Catholic priest, where it would be radically different. I teach this in a course on religion and literature to freshmen at Washington University in St. Louis, and I read The Power and the Glory before this, and then I read this, and then we read Go Tell It on the Mountain by James Baldwin, which are 3 great novels to read in a row. A Catholic priest, a Congregationalist minister, and a Pentecostal Black church, and they're all radically different expressions of Christianity. And so that's one of the points I make to my class, which often is 2/3 or so religiously illiterate, is that these are all Christian traditions, and they're radically different. Yeah, there's plenty more to say on that, but it is deeply Calvinist in that sense.
So no one's going to go with me on the alternate history, or?
I don't know that she mentions Martin Luther anywhere. Maybe you guys know. I don't think she engages with Luther hardly at all, if ever. But I was going to say that the Calvinist thing for Robinson has an historical importance. She wants to connect her novels, herself, to New England, where she went to college at Brown. She has this strong affinity with that region, and she wants, she has a narrative of America in mind that really does privilege the place of the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the Puritan culture that started there. She, that reformed world, she wants to connect back to it. So I don't know what the Lutheran analogy to that would be, but it wouldn't be this kind of origin narrative that Robinson wants to kind of, I'd say, claim.
Yeah, in effect, I suppose what I'm looking for is death comes for the Archbishop, except for, a Lutheran missionary to Iowa. I will shift gears very quickly. Robert Carl asks, I am surprised that there's been no mention of the role of baseball in the novel. Is there, in point of fact, tell us about the role of baseball in the novel and its deep mythic significance. Anyone?
I guess I'll go first again. So one of the things I have my students do is track. I mean, so one of the ways that this cuts between romanticism and realism is that the role of the symbol in romanticism is just out there. It's explicit. Like if you think of the comet A in the sky and the Scarlet Letter, like it's just like, hey, I'm a symbol. Think about me. Whereas if you think about the house in The Rise of Silas Lapham, that's a symbol that develops all the way through the story in that great novel, but is part of the plot of the story that realistically occurs, and then the house burns down and has all this meaning, and then the house burns down. But it's a realist symbol in the sense that it's not announcing itself as a symbol. So that's the way I think about baseball in this novel. It cuts between the two things, sort of say, hey, I'm a symbol, I'm a symbol, I'm a symbol. But not really. It's just part of the story. It's just the thing that the old man listens to on the radio. If you think about what baseball is, I mean, among other things, and I'll just leave it at this one point, I have my students track all the imagery of baseball, and, it functions incredibly importantly in this novel in lots of different scenes. But what is the point of baseball but to get home? And what is to get home safely, basically? And one of the kind of key features throughout this novel is, what does it mean to be at home? And this minister, having lived all of his life but never felt at home in his house, suddenly feels at home and doesn't want to leave it. He's gotten home, and he's writing from that perspective. And that's one of the ways to think about one of the resonances of baseball in this novel. Just real quickly, and the others can jump in on baseball, but other things I ask my students to track as they read is what gets buried, what gets burned, what gets baptized. And there's a lot of things in the novel that fits all of those categories, and you can begin to think about the novel through each one of those perspectives.
Yeah, one of the things that I was wrestling around with is one of the features of this novel that makes it a great American novel is the role of tradition. And I think baseball is kind of one of those things. Like we Americans, I think, are poor on traditions. And so, like when the African American church burns, and something that they bury are the Bibles that are burned. And I think there's a line like, it's Reverend Ames reflecting back on that, of like, old people always knew what to do in these kinds of situations. And with the lack of tradition, we don't know what to do in certain situations. Like, what would you do with Bible? Like, if your church burned down, what would you do with the Bibles that were there? But they always knew what to do with it. And tradition gives us that sense of kind of rootedness, history. And I don't know if baseball plays that role, but I think tradition, I guess, is what I'm saying, is I think is a theme, knowing what to do in certain situations. That I think even if you look at contemporary culture, baseball's out of style. It's something that those old people like. It's not something that we like anymore.
Well, and it's a slow game, right? In the same way this is a slow novel, right?
Right,
So one
yeah.
of the most famous lines in a review about this novel that I've seen quoted 100 times about this novel, and I still think it's a great line. James Wood wrote about this novel. He said, gradually, Robinson's novel teaches us how to read it. That is, as you read it, the novel teaches you how to read it. Suggests how we might slow down to walk at its own processional pace, and how we might learn to coddle its many fine details. And I think baseball just fits the pace of this novel.
One more thing about baseball is, she weaves in the race theme as well. But, I think Ames, when he's a child, goes with his grandfather to watch Bud Fowler play baseball, one of the first African-American baseball players. So it has this connection to race, it has the connection to community. She is doing a lot with baseball. I wouldn't call it a baseball novel, but it's there.
Thank you. Okay. Your answer has touched a bit on Barbara Castle's question. I may go back to some of the rest of it, but I'm going to go now to Naomi Ledine's question. Robinson's novel Housekeeping has a strong theme and perhaps a romantic view of transience. Are Robinson's ideas here fundamentally at odds with the ideas of Gilead, that rootedness is necessary to see beauty? Does this shed any light on the university's preference for housekeeping? Thank you.
I think I started the last couple, so this one I'm going to sit out till y'all answer first. It's a good question, I would say. But
could somebody actually, one of the three of you, very briefly summarize the plot of Housekeeping so that the audience, in case they haven't read it, have some idea what it's about in distinction from Gilead?
Sure. Well, it's a beautiful novel. I mean, it's just incredible. And it was written in 1980, 81, something like that, almost 20 years or more than 20 years before Gilead. But anyway, Ruthie is the main protagonist in that novel, and she lives in a town in Idaho, secluded town, and her father, I believe, dies in the train incident, and then her mother ends up committing suicide, so she's orphaned. And raised by a bunch of other people until her sort of somewhat odd aunt chooses to raise her, and her aunt is very transient. And the whole time it's the difference between her and her sister who wants to be domestic, who wants to live a normal life like everyone else, who wants to integrate into the town, and Ruthie feeling more and more separated from all of that. And the novel ends with Ruthie and her aunt basically taking off and living a life of transience. And it's even unclear in the novel whether she is speaking from the grave, like as a ghost, like she's dead, or whether she's actually still alive in transience, moving around the country, sort of haunting her sister. And so, yes, it's very much a novel of transience. There is no set home. The only home that they live in gets flooded out. The borders between the inside and the outside of that home are never kept clear. And so, yeah, it's very much about movement and transience and so forth. Whereas Gilead is, as the questioner asked, very much about rootedness and about being loyal to a town over 100 years and not wanting to leave that town. And what does that mean? To have a house in that town and to make it a home. And so I do think it is in that way radically different. There's also a radical 2 decades in between the two novels, where Marilynne Robinson said she re-educated herself by reading through all the 1980s, a whole bunch of other stuff. So it wouldn't be impossible for her to be taking a very different tack on things, or for her to feel like these are two sides of a similar coin. But anyway, I'd love to hear from others what you think of it.
I just want to interrupt before they do. Clearly, this appeals to academics because the academic life is one of uprootedness and transience. She's telling the story of the professors. I mean, that's not just a joke. I mean, I want to put that seriously as why it would appeal.
Yeah, I think it appeals in part because, well, it had an extra 2 decades to draw fandom before Gilead came out. It's also its religious tones are muted. They're there, but they're muted, and its feminist tones are heightened, and there's a lot to love about the novel in those ways. But it had a lot of fans before Gilead came out, so that's part of the difference.
One of the other two, Alex or Alex?
One of my great shames is that Housekeeping is the one Marilynne Robinson book that I have not read. So I have nothing to say.
I don't know that I have too much more to add to what Abram has already said. I do think they're very different books in this precise sense that Naomi's question is calling attention to, that one is the later novels, especially Gilead, is rooted in a particular place. Housekeeping seems to advocate an embrace of transience. And I would say, the fact that Ruth goes with Sylvia and it's basically from Ruth's perspective, it seems to value this idea that this kind of hobo transient way of life that they eventually embrace is a positive response to the fact of flux, change, time, almost this Buddhist sense that everything is always in flux. Something happened to Robinson in between writing Housekeeping and Gilead, and that's never actually been totally, it's not exactly clear. She's answered that question in a number of different ways. The primary way is that she went through this process of re-education, and that's where the Death of Adam essays, that collection, which is fantastic, my favorite of her essay collections, kind of came out of that. So Housekeeping's hard to read as a specifically kind of Christian novel. It seems to have a lot more pagan in it, to my mind.
Well, what's interesting too, I mean, when you think about those two novels side by side, probably the most famous passage of Housekeeping is a moment where she's sitting out in the cold, almost freezing to death, and thinking about desire as almost its own fulfillment. Ruth is, and it's this incredible passage, which I don't have in front of me, otherwise I'd read it, but it's probably the most quoted passage from Housekeeping. And desire there, the longing for things becomes almost the reality of the things that are longed for, but they aren't there, but they're that close and they're that real in the longing for them that they almost satisfy the longing just by longing that hard for them. And you get that sense in Gilead of the minister who has longed all of his life of solitude. He is transient in the sense that we get the image of him night after night after night wandering the streets of Gilead when everybody else is asleep, or when everybody else is indoors with their family, and he's looking through the windows. And in that sense, it takes off exactly from where Housekeeping left off, except the difference is that this minister does find a wife, does have a child, does get inside. The longing is, in a certain sense, actually fulfilled instead of being fulfilled merely by longing for it. And I think that's one of the great differences between these two novels.
Thank you. I am going to go back to Dr. I don't know, Barbara Castle's question, if doctor, pardon me for missing that. The second half, I already, she wrote an article in Front Porch Republic on Matt Robinson. The bit about, moving towards, more towards romanticism. Well, do you find, as I think I do, that Robinson moves more toward romanticism from Gilead to Jack? Robinson was reticent to write Jack. Could this be because of this movement toward a deeper, darker, mysterious, transcendent resonance in Jack that is different from the earthiness of Gilead, something she may have been more familiar with?
I'll jump in. I don't know if I would maybe describe Jack that way, because like Gilead not having a plot for the first 100 pages, the first 70 pages of Jack is this one scene in a graveyard, and but I think what becomes more apparent in Jack than in any, at least Gilead and maybe any other of the Lila Home, that I think relationship comes to the forefront in Jack in a way that it hasn't in the other novels. And what I mean by that is Jack was, I'm actually writing, almost done with an article on this idea that what awakens Jack to being alive is this love from Della. And so this is maybe way more than you want to know, but Jean-Luc Marion has this idea of the erotic phenomenon, that to be or not to be is typically the phenomenological question. But Marion says, no, there's a previous question. Before we ask to be or not to be, what makes being worth being alive? And the first reduction is that, well, am I loved? And he says, well, no, that's not really it, because if I ask, am I loved? And I have to ask, am I lovable? The answer is no, and I can't project that on other people. So I have to ask, the erotic reduction is, am I capable of love? That's the phenomenological question. And I think what you can see happen in Jack is that kind of question coming alive of Jack is awakened to living by the love of another and the commitment, the faithfulness, the loyalty of that love that then causes him to love. And so I think there are many of the common themes. I don't think it switches, but I think the relationality of care and love from another is the thing that switches for Jack. And I think the idea that, like Robinson said, she could never imagine writing a book about Jack because he seemed too mysterious, too fallen, too that she couldn't get in his mind. I think I think this idea of even time, right? This 70, 80, 90 pages of one conversation in a graveyard, which again is an interesting place to ask phenomenological questions, to be or not to be, that awakens Jack. And then the rest of the novel is like, I'm going to keep living to prove I'm going to keep living basically for Della to prove that I'm, it's not worthy, but he uses a word like worthy, that I'm not, that I can reform my life. And it's only in this context of relationship that happens. And so, maybe you guys can talk to the romantic or realist notions of the changes, but that's what I see in Jack. Most pointedly is the relationship that awakens life in Jack in a way that he didn't think life was worth living.
other folks?
I'll just say I'm interested in reading the piece spoken of there in the Q&A, because I'd want to know what is meant by romanticism and how we get more of one than the other in that transition. I think romanticism can be defined in a number of different ways, and so I think it's an interesting thesis. I just want to read more.
I will just add that I'm now putting the link to that in the chat link so that everybody, panelists and audience, can now read the article that way. So let's see. So query on how it's taken by students. After all, I gather you've all taught it. And I guess the question is, how should I put this? It was already evoking a place and time that was distinctly past most Americans' immediate knowledge by the time it came out. And now there's been another generation of historical change. How alien is it to modern students? How much needs to be explained to them? How much is this, a widening of the America they know, and how much of this is a door to an America they've never known?
So it's definitely the distant unknown past to students, but so is most literature that we read. So that doesn't necessarily change for them. But so my students are sort of split. Some of them love it immediately, and they love it for the slowness of it. I think they don't often read things that slow them down, and they enjoy it. And others feel itchy and impatient and bored out of their mind by it. And I usually do a sales pitch for the novel because I love it so much, and explain to them that they may not love it at the beginning, but they will by the end, and I'll teach them why I love it and try to have that rub off on them. So there's that. I would say, though, that for me, what's so interesting about teaching this novel in the setting in which I teach it, which is Washington University in St. Louis, is that I have, when I teach this course, I usually have about 15 students. I have one or two, for lack of a better term, evangelical students. A third of my class tends to be Jewish, either practicing or not. And most of my students tend not to have any religious background at all. And what's surprising to me when I teach this novel is just how much needs to be filled in. There's so many allusions, so much background, so much theology that it does, for some of them, it's a little hard to get traction. Even to the point where a central sermon, a central theme of the novel is Abraham, Hagar, and Ishmael, and that whole relationship and that whole story from the Bible, which was the first time I taught this novel years ago. It was the Abraham story is central to three of the novels in the course, and I realized that a third of my students didn't have any sense of the Abraham story, or they had never heard of Hagar. They had no idea about this whole Abraham story or cycle. And so there was so much background that needed to happen in order for the richness of this text to take off. And any text that is deeply intertextual, the richness of it depends upon a knowledge of the other texts. It doesn't have to be that way. You can love a novel without knowing any of the allusions, but it becomes richer and richer the more you know of all the intertextuality that is there. And the more you know of the biblical stories that inform this story, the richer this story becomes. And so a lot of it is this background teaching to get people up to speed with what she's pulling from and what influences her. Just quick example, she's a Shakespeare scholar. She did a PhD in Shakespeare, dissertation on Shakespeare. And for example, the very last line of Gilead is a direct quote from King Lear. First I'll pray and then I'll sleep. That's pulled straight from King Lear, which most people don't know or wouldn't know. But then you begin to look back through the story and ask, in what sense is this a King Lear kind of story, and in what sense isn't? And suddenly the whole text begins to pop in a different way. So anyway, I just stop there and leave it there.
Yeah, my teaching this book comes in a different context because I teach Bible ministry. And so I look at it because I'm not trained as a literature person. I taught this as in a foundations of Christian ministry class. And so we looked at it more of what are the we read it as a novel, but like just the imagination, the posture of ministry of Reverend Ames, looking at some of the, reckonings with race and things like that. And so I think my students, it's hard in a ministry class because, right, when we're reading theology, but then we transition to this slow novel, it can be hard to get into. But I think by the end of it, I think most of the students had appreciation of like the type of at least appreciating the type of minister that Reverend Ames tried to be. And I think there's lots of like reckonings of like how hard it is to love difficult people, or even dealing with like these sermons that we want to preach but we can't preach, and so we burn them, or having your mind different places when you're trying to baptize somebody, and like all of those kind of ministerial difficulties or challenges or blessings. And so that was kind of the way that I've taught it, was in that class. And so it was less literature heavy in making those connections, and more maybe practical theology wise making those connections. So, but overall, I think students, apart from pace at times, found that there was something there for them.
I've had similar issues teaching this book. I don't always teach this book. My primary job is teaching, sophomore surveys in American literature. And I always call it a slow burn, and try to get students. I try to do a lot of prep work before reading to tell them about the pacing. But I really love reading the book aloud in class, and I try to get them into the, like I talked about in my talk, the voice of Ames and his sensibility. And I feel like the students that do connect with the book kind of get a connection to that voice and the sensibility and attitude toward the world that Ames embodies. There is a lot of history to fill in, and my students, generally speaking, don't know certain just basic things about American history. So it's a challenging book to teach. I like it because it's not on the long side, so that's always a positive for me. And this, my students, their attention span is can be quite brief. So teaching novels in the age of Twitter always presents challenges. So, and I think that this one in particular, in its pre-Twitter universe, just poses some formal challenges for the student today.
I think it's also just worth emphasizing that any 18-year-old, no matter how well educated, is not going to know a lot of history. Like even a very well educated 18-year-old, there's going to be some major gaps, and that's fine. That's what we're there for. That's what we're teaching for. So, I taught Salman Rushdie's Satanic Verses to a freshman class a few times, which was a heavy lift. But I'll tell you what, there is so much 1980s British history in that book, and my students are like, my American students, of course, like, they don't even know who Margaret Thatcher is. So, like and these are well-educated students. So it's not just about religious illiteracy or something. It's just that 18-year-olds is not that long on the face of the earth to learn a lot about the earth and the history of it. So that's what we're there for, though. That's what these novels allow us to talk about. That's what a novel like Gilead allows us to do, is to talk about that period of history that runs from abolition to civil rights, to talk about bloody Kansas, to talk about these amazing incidents, but also then the rise of Jim Crow and the kind of failure of so many reforms in the Civil War to take hold. So anyway, I just say that's what teaching is for.
Thank you. And on that note, I'm actually going to switch to asking the three of you for concluding statements, because we've gotten to about 3:30. May I ask for each of you for a concluding statement of perhaps a minute or so, again, in alphabetical order. So I think that would be Dr. Engebretson first.
Sure. Well, I kind of ended my talk with this idea about Robinson's kind of greater influence on American literature. And that's something that that's going to be interesting to see as it plays out. She draws from these traditions that we've all been talking about: Calvinism, the American Renaissance. I am not sure, and just kind of her liberal Protestant sensibility, I am not sure. I mean, I would guess that these sources for her works are not among the most prevalent in younger authors' minds. So her voice and her sensibility, I think, are really going to stand out as being kind of utterly strange and unique as American literature kind of goes forward. And I think I'll just echo what one of y'all said, is that, you know, she brought a seriousness and to the American novel about ideas and this deep sense of human dignity, the Imago Dei, the kind of like everyone's created in the image of God. I see those as like being her kind of contribution to American letters, and where ultimately her reputation's going to kind of be made or broken, depending on if people pick up on her work or not.
Yeah, and I think along similar lines, I mean, I think it's interesting that a novel about a small town in Iowa reverend became a New York Times bestseller. And, you know, she's pen pals with Barack Obama. And like, how did that happen, right? I thought we lived in a secular America where religious belief was declining. Yeah, we have this novel that has obvious theological and religious themes that is being read by a lot of people. And so, you know, whatever you make of our culture, I do think what makes Marilynne Robinson so endearing are those things of this deep graciousness and generosity in the tone and the posture with which she writes, and her, you know, what she says is a love for her characters that she writes in, and why she didn't like Flannery O'Connor, because she didn't think like Flannery loved her characters. I think you can debate that, but I think that idea of kind of this this image of God's soul, sacramental, earthy spirituality, these things that we've talked about, makes it just a really a light, kind of a bright light of a novel in a society that tends to be suspicious, full of critique. I think Robinson just adds light to our cultural conversation, and writes books that are not just sentimental, but that are deeply spiritual, that reckons with brokenness. It's not just kind of painting this everything's fine and everything's bright, and but that focuses on on a graciousness. So that's why I commend it.
I'll just pick up on that and say, I do think she has a really unique voice, a really unique perspective that combines a sense of criticism and a really all kind of powerful look at the failures of America in relation to racial justice over the course of its history, combining that with a sense of graciousness and hopefulness and love of the very people who have failed. And that's rare. That's not easy to do. And I think it's also not easy to write a novel about a person who's fundamentally lovable. in a way that's not sentimental. And I just think there's nobody who writes quite like her, and nobody who writes quite like from that kind of perspective. And in that sense, I think she just stands out. I think whether she persists over time or not, what she has done here is not being done by other people. And it's worth reading just to see what that is.
Thank you. Thank you so much, all. I will just say thank you all. Thank you to our audience. I will just say again that we have recorded this. This is available, or will be within 24 hours on the National Association of Scholars YouTube channel. So go there and read it, see it. And I will just say we are continuing our webinar series. January 20th, we are having the next one in our history. That's on the Great Depression, followed a week after that, or 2 weeks, one on 1933. When do we have our next novel one? I don't immediately have when we have our next novel one, but we are continuing in the novel, a Great American Novel, Great American Literature series, and we will try very hard to keep it up to the high level you've gotten here today. Thank you again all so very much.
Thank you.